It seemed like ever since the Supreme Court took up the New York Rifle Pistol Club versus Bruen and gave their ruling on it, that a whole can of worms have been opened up from state to state, ultimately banning certain guns, banning certain capacities. And I want to take a moment and just speak to the idea of, does the government know how many and what kind of guns you have? Because as people who own certain guns in a certain state one day woke up the next day, suddenly that gun is illegal. So does the government know you have that gun? And how many of them do you have? Do they know these things? Well, this is a very complicated question to answer, which is why we're going to take some time and do that. Let's start with, when you go buy a gun and you fill out your form, that form stays with the gun store forever, as long as that gun store is in business. And we'll come back to that, because if they go out of business, that's a whole different story. But as long as they stay in business, that form is going to stay there. Now, what's on that form is ultimately what we'll say is it a long gun? Is it a handgun? Is it an other firearms? But it won't give a lot of detail into actual gun itself other than the serial number. Now, if that store closes down, then all of those documents go into the ATF's holding facility, and then they do technically have a record. But if you've ever seen that facility, it's billions and billions and billions of pages of documents just bursting at the seams in that building. So when you're just kind of minding your own business, doing your own thing, I guess the answer is they know they could know you have a gun. They just don't know necessarily what kind it is. It's either a long gun, handgun, or other firearms. But they really don't know. I mean, unless they're looking at that gun store. Now, what I'll also say is that if they're looking for a certain kind of gun, this is where you're going to probably run into trouble. Because if they're looking for a certain kind of gun that has been banned, let's just say they ban ARs. So they go to what they'll do is they'll do a reverse trace of those guns, and they'll track them down to the individual owners, and then they will know what kind of guns you have, but only those specific guns. So let me give you an example. Let's say they ban ARs. And the ATF will then go to every single manufacturer of the AR, and they'll say, in the last decade or however long, give us a record of all the guns you sold to distributors. And then they'll say, well, here's the thousands of guns that we sold to distributors. Then they'll go to those distributors and they'll say, okay, we have these thousands of guns we need to trace. Where did you sell them to? And then they'll say, well, I sold 3 to this store, 10 to that store. And ultimately, then they'll go to that store and they'll say, okay, we see that you have 3 of these guns. Who did you sell them to? And then that'll ultimately lead to you. And that's really kind of the part that is, the one that we should probably be the most concerned about. And I want to address electronic documentation here in a second as well. But ultimately what it comes down to is, if they're looking for a certain kind of gun, they definitely can trace it back to you. If they're just looking to see how many guns you have, I think that's kind of an impossible task to come down to. They'd have to first search you by name specifically, but then again, they don't know which gun stores you went to. So really, it's an impossible task to know what kind of guns you have and how many you have, unless they're doing a reverse trace on a specific gun. All right. So with that being said, ultimately, no, they don't know how many guns you have or what kind that you have, unless they're doing a reverse trace or that gun store closed down. But then they kind of just have a general idea. But they really don't even know then, because it just gets packed with the other billions of documents. So ultimately, no, they do not know what kind of guns you have or how many you have. Is the paper trail there? Yes. Could they follow it? No, I don't believe they could. But if they want to know if you have a certain gun and they do a reverse trace from the manufacturer back to you, yes, they definitely can. All right, with that being said, let's talk about electronic applications. So when you go fill out a background check, if you do an electronic version of them, there is a collection of those taking place with the ATF. They're not supposed to, but they are. And they're ultimately arguing that it's this technology piece of the space, the amount of space that they have, is limiting their access to these documents, so they have to do them electronically. So this is something that you have to kind of wake up to, that what we're seeing now is if you go in a store and you do an electronic application, it's going to the ATF. Now, what I'll also say is if a store closes down, a lot of those documents are now going to electronic as well. So kind of what I said earlier about a store closing down, you get these giant paper trails here, but they're going electronic as well. So we kind of have to, you know, a year from now, I'm going to remake this video and it's going to be even different because of what they're doing electronically. But as of now, I wouldn't fill out electronic applications. I just do paper applications only. I mean, I know they all go through the same NICS system, but it's still an electronic document versus a paper document. So there you go. Do they know what kind of guns you have, or how many? No, they don't. Do they know, can they find out if you have a certain gun? Yes, they could do a reverse trace and absolutely lead straight to you. So any thoughts or insight on that, definitely put that below. I would like to take a moment and say that most people that watch this channel, they're not subscribers to the channel. Please take a moment, hit that subscribe button. It greatly increases the algorithm and our ability to get these messages out. That link is below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests. So please don't ever hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, love guns.